Okay. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm James Rutt. I'm one of the economists here at the CMA. I've got some of my colleagues here, Carol, Sabine, Alex, and Layla, and we're going to give you an insight of life as an economist at the CMA. The way the session's going to work is I'll give an overview of the econ group in general and the roles that we have that are open or about to open and how to apply and so on. Then Carol will talk about working as an assistant director, or what sometimes referred to as a grade 6. Sabine will talk about her role as an economic advisor, what we call a grade 7. And then also Alex and Layla will talk about their experiences of Manchester and Edinburgh, respectively. There'll also be an opportunity for questions, so please put questions in the chat and we will pick them up. But without further ado, an overview of the econ team at the CMA. So we're a group of now over 120 economists. We work alongside the econometricians, the data teams, that's the data technology team at the CMA, and then the other professions, so lawyers in particular, and so on, across the whole range of CMA cases. And as you will hear, one of the best things about being an economist at the CMA is how our analysis is fundamental to the outcomes of so many of the CMA's cases. And our responsibilities are growing, and with now a greater variety of projects. So 5 years ago, I think we would largely have been looking for people to come and work on our market cases, on mergers work, on competition and consumer enforcement cases. But in the last few years, we've also gained responsibility for the subsidy advice unit, the office for the internal market, and soon we're expecting the digital markets unit to gain new powers. And then we have offices in various locations in the country. So we have a base in Canary Wharf. We then have an office in Edinburgh, the Manchester office, which is intended to be a hub for the digital markets unit. And then we have smaller offices in the Belfast and Cardiff. And then also we have a team, the microeconomics unit, which is a bit different to sort of the traditional CMA econ work, who are based in Darlington. In terms of what we're looking for, we're currently recruiting for assistant directors of economics or grade 6s. We're also shortly going to be recruiting for economic advisors, and we also have positions open for econometric advisors. In terms of the profile of person we're looking for, ultimately, we're looking for someone who is a good microeconomist. So if you're good at thinking logically, focusing on incentives and identifying the key details from the messy real world, then you're the sort of economist that we're looking for. We have obviously having a background in competition or regulation is an advantage, but we have a really strong L&D culture to help people get up to speed quickly if you have a more general background. And some of the key softer skills, which will hopefully come through when people are talking, are working at pace. So a lot of what we do is subject to statutory deadlines, communicating and influencing. So obviously our economic analysis, we need it to affect the decisions that are made, and we have to communicate those decisions to non-economists. And then scoping and managing. So we have a limited pool of economists who can do work, and a never-ending, essentially, list of things that we could, in theory, find interesting and go and investigate. So which ones are we going to prioritize? Which ones are we going to have the most impact? In terms of what we're looking for if you do apply for a role, a lot of what we're interested in is examples that illustrate how you meet the criteria, and focus on in those examples on how you achieved particular outcomes. So you might hear people talk about the STAR format, so talking about situation, task, action, result, which can be a helpful way of thinking about how to structure your answer and communicate your experiences. But if you're doing that, I mean, what we're really interested in is the action part of that, so what you did. One thing that can really help us when we're looking at applications is if you can make sure it's really clear how your examples link up to the criteria that are in the job advert. So which bit of your application are relevant to which criteria in a role profile or a job advert, and so on. In terms of how to apply, all our jobs are listed on the Civil Service Jobs website. The web address is there. You can find the jobs just by looking for roles for economists within the Competition and Markets Authority. In terms of deadlines, the econometric advisor position, if you have a particular interest in econometrics, is due to close on the 8th of March. The assistant director positions is going to close on the 13th of March, and the econometric advisors, that round isn't open yet, but we're expecting it to be in early April. We'll then go through a process of sifting applications once each of those deadlines is passed, and people who are successful in that sifting process will be invited to an interview, and there's just one round of interviews. So that's a high-level overview of the team and what we're looking for and how to apply. And now I'll hand over to Carol to talk about working as an assistant director.
Brilliant, thank you. Can people hear me okay? Yeah, great. So I'm an assistant director in the economics team. I've been working in that role for about 2.5 years. The role of an assistant director is pretty varied, and in particular it depends what type of case you're working on, the size and the experience of the team that you're working with. So for example, in the last year or so I've largely not managed, which is a bit unusual for an assistant director, but in a more normal case you could be managing directly or indirectly 4 or 5 people potentially, and thinking about the work of them as well as your own workload. So if you are in that situation of managing a team, you've got a variety of different things you need to make sure are done either by you or by the people that you're managing, the economic advisors or the assistant economists. So typically you'd be thinking about the scope of the analysis, getting the right thinking about the right questions and the right evidence to answer those questions. There's also quite a lot of work for the assistant director on engaging with other professions. So we work with a legal team, delivery team, financial experts, people who think about remedies to problems that we find, and influencing those different team members is an important part of particularly the assistant director's role. There's also a lot of engagement with external parties, whether that's merger parties, people who we call third parties, so not directly involved in the investigation but have got an interest in it. And this assistant director oversees a lot of that work. Also thinking about the evidence gathering, making sure that you're gathering the right information, and then analysing it and bringing that together. And then sort of the outputs typically of our work are drafting and presenting to decision makers. So again, there's a balance between what you do yourself and what you delegate to other members in your team. I'm going to talk about my role on the Norton-Avast merger, which was a year and a half ago. So Norton was buying Avast, both of which provide antivirus software, plus a bunch of other cybersecurity products. Exactly what they do is not particularly relevant. So if you've not heard of them, don't worry. Norton in particular had a big competitor in McAfee, which is a big player in antivirus, but there was also Microsoft, which if you know anything about Microsoft computers, they've got some inbuilt security within them, and then there's a bunch of other suppliers in the market. So the key kind of question that we were asking was, after or before the merger, would Norton's customers switch to Avast as an alternative, and vice versa? Because post-merger, those customers that would switch elsewhere rather than to one of the competitors would be within the same company, and therefore it sort of changes the incentives of the merged company to offer as good a deal if they will recapture anyone who switches elsewhere. So we're also interested in where they would switch, where customers potentially would switch if Norton worsened what it offered. So in terms of the types of evidence that we looked at and why, and then we'll talk a little bit about my role within those types of evidence. So they've got a couple of slides on this, and different sort of buckets and types of analysis that we did. So shares of supply. Thinking about who is present in the market, how big are they, and what's their relative importance. In a market like antivirus or cybersecurity, the products are really quite differentiated. So there's a big role here in thinking about what are the differences between the companies, and how do we understand their size in the context of them all offering something slightly different. And of course, in this market, we had a complication because not all the products are paid for. So how do you think about market shares if you're doing them in monetary terms, if some products are free? And my particular role in this was supervising the people doing the analysis and then helping the decision makers think correctly about those different issues around the differentiated products and how you interpret free products. We also looked at parties' internal documents, so things like how do they internally think about how their business is evolving, and how do they think about their competitors and each other. And the important thing I was thinking about in that context was about supervising the team, scoping the analysis properly, making sure they were doing things using the right methodology, but also assessing and interpreting the results correctly. We also looked at the parties' consumer survey. We didn't do our own survey, but we were looking at, could we learn anything about their customers from their own survey? And that involved me working with the stats team and thinking about the reliability of the results of their survey. We also spent a bit of time looking at third-party evidence, so both their opinions and the documentary evidence that they produced. And we were particularly interested in thinking about how industry participants and industry experts think about the competitors and Norton and Avast themselves, and is there potential harm from the merger? For competitors, we also wanted to know what their future plans were. Were they going to be doing something that was more similar to the parties in the future or less similar? So again, it's about supervising the team, supporting them to do this analysis. And I think I also played a role in thinking about respondents' incentives. So certain competitors might have an interest in the merger going ahead or not going ahead because of the way it would affect the industry for them as an industry participant. So having those kind of consequences in mind when looking at evidence is really important. So continuing along the same line, we also looked at some analysis of online search advertising. So when you Google Norton, is anyone bidding to appear in the top sort of search terms for Norton and vice versa? This was quite a small piece of analysis, and I did that directly rather than managing somebody else doing it. The parties also submitted some customer switching analysis. So customers leaving Norton, where were they going instead? Were they going to Avast or were they going somewhere else? And they intended this to show that there was low switching between the parties. Because one of the things we were really interested in this merger was what's going to happen in the future. This wasn't something we thought was particularly insightful because of the way the market was changing. So I was involved in supervising the person who was reviewing this analysis. And my final two buckets of things that I did are not analysis themselves, but things that make sure the analysis happens and that the right outcomes occur. So project management. Obviously, I was leading the team, thinking ahead, monitoring deadlines, setting expectations to make sure things were delivered on time. And then I think for the assistant director, influencing decision makers is really important, whether that's internally within the case team or whether that's an external decision maker. So making sure your team are presenting well and that you're stepping in to support your team. If it's a particularly tricky issue that you present it yourself, troubleshooting problems that are going on, and making sure that you've got broad agreement from all professions before you head into important decision-making meetings. So I think we're now over to Spiel on life as an econ advisor.
Okay, so I'm Siobel. I joined, excuse me, I joined the CMA last May, so I've been here sort of just under a year. I'm going to focus here on sort of life as an economic advisor in phase 1 mergers, because that's where I've sort of spent my time since I joined last May. So in terms of the kind of key roles, so some of this overlaps with what Carol was talking about, because as she said, there's a kind of division that goes on between the G6 and the G7, and then some aspects of the case will be sort of working together. So some things which the G7 does specifically. So we're thinking about kind of areas for investigation. So if you're thinking about a merger, what are the theories of harm that you're concerned about? Once you've identified those, thinking about what analysis you want to do to understand those a bit better. What evidence you're going to gather to understand those better. So what types of evidence, so things like internal documents or shares of supply. You're doing the analysis, so you're maybe a bit more involved in kind of the weeds of things than the G6 might be typically. So doing more of the review of internal documents, more of the quantitative analysis. And then you're also involved in the write-up of that analysis at the end. And then depending on, again, the sort of split with the G6, you might be communicating or presenting on certain aspects of the analysis at various points during the case. And then I'm going to focus on one particular case. So this is a phase 1 on Arçelik Whirlpool. So these are two companies who are both involved in kind of retailing certain kind of household things that you'd be familiar with sort of in your kitchen. So fridges, freezers, cookers, ovens, various different large appliances that you have in your homes. And they have a kind of various different brands that they then market under. So under Arçelik, we had Beko, Bloomberg and Grundig. And then under Whirlpool, Intercept, Whirlpool and the Hot brand as well. In terms of the role of the economic advisor on that case, so it was thinking about what the theories of harm were. So in this particular case, we had 6 different horizontal theories of harm, and those were relating to all the kind of different products that they were selling. So we had a horizontal theory for fridges, and then a horizontal theory for freezers, and so on. And then so it was thinking about what kinds of evidence you would gather to support or understand those theories of harm. So on this particular case, it was a lot of evidence on shares of supply, there was internal documents, there was third-party evidence from various customers and competitors. And we also had sort of further pricing analysis, which we based on the shares of supply, which I'll go on to in the next slides. So then once we gathered all that evidence, and that involved sort of reviewing the internal documents and splitting that work as well with other professions. And then you were leading on calls with customers and competitors. So thinking about what questions you wanted to ask them and then sort of putting those questions to them. You're drafting questionnaires to send out to the various customers and competitors and then pulling that all together at the end in terms of the competitive assessment. So one particular aspect of this kind of case that was quite interesting was about sort of the pricing in the market. So as I mentioned, there was kind of various different companies, but then each of those had lots of different brands. So what we saw on the market was that there was sort of a whole plethora of brands competing at various different ends of the pricing spectrum, and sort of some were more high end, some a bit more entry level, and then sort of lots in between. So it was kind of an interesting aspect was thinking about, well, how do we consider the fact that some of these are maybe competing at particular price segments more closely with each other than their other competitors who might be more premium, say. So we thought about what analysis we could gather, which would sort of help us to understand this a bit better. So we understood from the evidence that we had on, say, internal documents that price was important to customers in this market. So they were also concerned about things like quality, but price was important. It was really kind of driving decisions. And we knew that the parties were looking at their competitors in terms of where they were placed in pricing segments. So whether they were more present in an entry level segment or a more premium segment. So we were considering then, well, how do we kind of take this all into account? On the one hand, we know that suppliers who are maybe priced more similarly are more likely to be exerting a competitive constraint on each other. But also there might be suppliers which are sort of just in the next segment, and consumers, will still kind of consider those as potential options. So how do we take all of this into account? And we knew that although they were thinking about price segmentation in the industry, there was no kind of one way in which the companies were doing this. So they didn't have like a defined way of defining what entry level, say, is. So we kind of had a proxy for this, which was to look at shares of supply by quartile. So you would have sort of 25% of supply in each various quartile. And then we were looking at whether the parties were competing, whether they had higher shares of supplies in particular quartiles than others. And what we found was that the parties' brands were or had particularly high shares of supply in the lower to mid pricing segments. So they were competing maybe to a lesser degree for the more premium end of the market. And that was one kind of important aspect of the evidence that we gathered, which alongside other evidence, so for example, reviewing the internal documents, we ultimately found that the transaction raised a realistic prospect of a substantial lessening of competition. And that was at the end of the phase 1 process. So the case ultimately went on to phase 2, but I left it there. And then I'll just spend a kind of couple of minutes. So I mentioned that I joined the CMA sort of last May. Prior to that, I spent 2 years sort of in-house in a telecoms firm, so working as for their regulatory and policy team. And then prior to that, I spent 5 years at Ofcom. So my background was more sort of on the regulation side of economics. So just to draw out sort of a couple of different aspects, I guess, to these different roles and my experience in the various jobs. So for the CMA, one aspect is that the sort of range of sectors is really interesting. So at Ofcom, you have a more sort of narrowly defined remit. So I spent most of my time on telecoms, and I did a bit of competition in for the BBC as well. But although there's sort of a range of sectors, that's still a bit more narrowly defined than, say, the CMA has. There's a really wide range of projects. I won't repeat kind of what was said earlier, but there's lots of different case types to get involved in. Whereas, say, working in-house, that was much more limited. You're thinking about mainly responding to consultations which are published by, say, the government or the regulator. Project timelines, so statutory deadlines, I guess, in particular, given I've been working in phase 1, there's sort of quicker timelines, and you're moving maybe around cases a bit more quickly than, say, where I worked at Ofcom, and we had these kind of 2 to 3 or even longer projects. Now that's slightly specific to me working on the kind of phase 1 cases. I think there's a bit of variation at the CMA as well. And then on L&D, again, just to reiterate, there's sort of lots of support and lots of training. So although I had sort of a regulation background, I was new to mergers, new to competition, and I found it really easy to settle in and sort of get access to all the materials that I needed to sort of feel comfortable doing the job. I think that's it from me. I'm handing over to Alex.
I think, Layla, your slides are first. So I don't know if you want to go first, but James, can you move the slides?
Yeah, I think we need to move.
The next slide.
Great, thank you. So I'm Layla, I'm Assistant Director of Economics at a CMA in Edinburgh. I joined in 2019, so it's been a few years now. Immediately prior to joining the CMA, I was also grade 6 at the Scottish Government, so it was a level transfer for me. But what I used to do at the Scottish Government was quite different to what I do at the CMA in terms of the nature of the job. I was in a very kind of typical policy analysis role that you get across the devolved government and central government as well. So the main role is to support policy development, and in my case, it was welfare policy in particular. So even though the jobs are quite different, I think there are quite a lot of transferable skills. So just thinking about what I used to do, a lot of my responsibilities were to provide the direction to the team, ensure that the quality of the analysis was of a high standard, influence policy and ministers. Obviously, that's quite a big part of your role if you work in central or devolved government. And again, going back to what a lot of people have said is important at the CMA, communicating analysis effectively, making sure that evidence is understood by everyone, and then all of the kind of typical sort of leadership and management responsibilities around developing people and that kind of thing. So other skills I found are very transferable to the CMA. So it's quite good to kind of be able to use those in my role now. I suppose what is quite different is that the nature of the job is different, in that there are no ministers, but I think also the extent to which we use economics is a bit different. I think we do use a bit more on a day-to-day basis. So I think if anyone's familiar with central government roles, quite often they're kind of a mixture of policy work and maybe just more general analysis. So I used to manage not just economists, but also statisticians and operational researchers. So actually it's a bit more of a mix, whereas at the CMA, I feel that you apply microeconomics a lot more consistently on a day-to-day basis. So if that's your thing, that's really quite interesting. I suppose the other thing that's quite different at the CMA is that you're close to decision makers. So quite often in central government or devolved government, my experience was that you do have to work quite hard to make sure you're in the room when decisions are being made. So you really have to develop those relationships with policy, make sure that you're there at the key meetings, get invited to meetings and ministers. What I really like about working in the CMA is that you get that seat at the table pretty much straight away. So I'm in phase 1 mergers at the moment, and decisions made by people who are already in your team in phase 1. Sometimes, those decisions are made by someone who works at the CMA, someone more senior, and they're not part of the case team, but, you're very much working very closely with them, and you get to present your case and your evidence to them. And in phase 2, and that was the case that Carol was talking about, the decisions are made by an independent panel, but you're there at those key meetings, and really the focus is about on making sure that the messages are clear, but you're there, you're presenting to the group. So that can be really interesting. I really like that aspect of the role. I suppose another thing to mention, I think some people have already said it, it can be quite fast-paced. So in phase 1 mergers, we've got the statutory deadline of 40 working days, and obviously within that you have quite a lot of intermediate deadlines as well. So as a grade 6 in phase 1 mergers, I manage several cases. So actually every week there is sort of an intermediate or final deadline. So you do have to be quite organized with your time, so that competency around delivering a pace, it's really quite important. So if you like that kind of thing, I think that's a really good role. But obviously we do lots of different things, and there are much longer term projects and cases that we have where deadlines are a lot more spaced out. I suppose just a final thing to say is that there is this drafting aspect that if you're transferring from the central government, it might feel a bit different. So quite often in central government, the focus is on producing very short and snappy bullet points for ministers, whereas here a lot of our work is published. So it's all about kind of presenting our evidence and making sure that the conclusions we make are transparent and based on evidence. I won't say much more on this aspect. I just wanted to mention the Edinburgh office. So we have a nice new office in a central location. We share it with other government departments. We have a growing team. We've got 15 economists, so we've got a lot of new people, but also some people have moved up from London. We get paid the same, so obviously the salary goes a bit further if you're not in London. And generally, it's already quite a big team in Edinburgh, so around 100 people in total. And just a final point, we're completely location neutral. So the way projects are allocated is completely independent of where you're based. So despite being based in Edinburgh, I've worked on some really interesting and high profile cases. So your location is not taken into account at all in that respect. So I think I'm handing over to Alex, who's based in Manchester.
So I'm Alex. I'm an economic advisor, and I've been at the CMA nearly a year now. So as Leila mentioned, I'm currently based in the Manchester office, and I also joined, like Leila, from central government, so Department for Culture and Media and Sport. And so I thought I'd just kind of reflect on my experience joining from central government, but also joining one of the newer CMA offices. So in terms of how I found this role compared to being an economist in central government, Layla mentioned and touched on some of these points, but I'll also kind of rehash some of those. So the three things I wanted to mention was kind of the role itself. There's a lot more economics, and I've kind of really enjoyed that aspect of it. So like Layla also touched upon, in my previous role, like I kind of would do economics one day, but then other days it'll be like more policy and legislative type of work. But I've kind of found in this role I've been doing much more economics, and that's really enjoyable for one end, but as well in terms of developing your skills as an economist, because I'm doing it a lot more. I think that's been really something that's been really enjoyable about the role. And then the second bit is just sort of this really kind of project-based nature of the role. So there's an opportunity to work across a variety of different tools. And although in my previous role, it was nice to be part of a small economist team working on a specific policy, what I've enjoyed about the CMA is that you are able to work on different tools and with different people. So you get that variety of the work, variety in the work that you do, but also the variety in the kind of the people that you interact with. And again, that's something that I found really valuable about the role. And then finally, this point around kind of the training that's on offer here. So I came from a non-competition background, so I didn't have extensive competition experience. And I've kind of really enjoyed the available kind of resources that the Economist puts forward, and I think that part of that is just the fact that we're kind of one joint profession, and I also like the fact that a lot of the training is employee-led. So kind of people kind of share knowledge, but also supplement that with their case experience, and that makes you kind of really pick up things really, really quickly. And I've kind of also really enjoyed that aspect of it. So in terms of the role, I've kind of really enjoyed this year that I've been here, and some of those aspects I've mentioned, I think are a big reason for that. And then finally, just to reflect on joining a new office. So the Manchester office is where I joined from, and it was a new office. So it's been open for around 18 months, and it's growing in terms of the number of people. So just kind of remember when I first joined, I think there was like 10 people here. And then now there's around 40 and it's growing. And what I actually enjoy about it is that although I'm currently the only economist based here, I've been able to kind of build relationships with people in other areas of the CMA. So you're able to understand more around what other departments do and how that fits in with the work. And I think that's been really good. And the other thing as well is also everyone in this office is really, really keen to make the office social and part a community. So we have a lot of things that we've all kind of organized, whether it be like book clubs, kind of cake days and payday drinks. And so kind of that's a really good aspect of being in the Manchester office, is that there's this community that's beginning to be built here, and I think that will improve as more and more people join. In terms of Manchester, I'll also plug it's obviously a great city to live in. I'm biased in that, but it generally is in terms of the location that we have for the office. So it's a really central location. So for commuting, it's really good in the sense that it's near kind of the main train stations, but also being in the city centre location, you also can actually do things like errands. If that's not that you'd come into the office for that, but you kind of have the option of doing that because we have got a really good location, and it's so I think it's really flexible in terms of that. And then I just wanted to finally mention this point. Even though I'm based in one of the new offices, I think the CMA's policies are really good and kind of supportive in helping you maintain relationships with colleagues in other offices. So I've had the opportunity to visit colleagues that I've been working with in London, and I've also taken that opportunity to meet other colleagues, economist colleagues that I'm not directly working with. So because of that support, you're able to build relationships. So I can kind of say that even though I've joined in one of the new offices, I haven't actually felt isolated and away from the wider team. And I think that's a really it stands testament to the fact that the CMA has and our team has really good policies around ensuring that we have that close collaboration with members located in other locations. So I think again, being in the Manchester office, I think has been really good, and we're kind of really supported in making sure that we're able to develop relationships with other colleagues based elsewhere. I think I'll finish there.
Okay. Thanks everyone, and hopefully that's given you all a good overview of what life is like here at the CMA. We have some time now for questions. I think people should be able to access the chat. So if you want to type in questions, we're happy to pick those up and answer them. So there's a question about the econometrics advisor role. I mean, in many ways, it's quite similar to the sort of roles that we've described more generally, but obviously with a focus on being able to conduct econometric analysis. So in many ways, the econometricians work in similar ways across cases. There'll be a particular project where, say, we know there's a big data set available, or the parties have submitted some econometric analysis, and they will work on that case and bring their particular expertise to bear on a particular case as when there's a need for that, and they will take on the same sort of responsibilities. So they will need to think about how they're going to scope their analysis, how they're going to make it fit in with the timelines of a case, what contingency planning they're going to do in case the ideal analysis that they really want to do doesn't come to fruition. So I think in many ways, a lot of the points people have made this evening apply, except that clearly the role is more focused on econometrics. And one final thing I'd say is that there is an element of people, sometimes econometricians do slightly more general economics roles, and people that have sort of moved out of being formally econometricians to become economists within the CMA, and vice versa. People have moved from being a sort of a economics role to specializing a bit more and having an econometrics role. I don't know if anyone else wants to ask. Okay. So there's then a question about data and the types of data we use. So maybe if I'll start and then people can jump in. I mean, it varies massively. Sometimes we are using data sets that are sort of commercially or publicly available, and we might have to do a little bit of processing of it, but maybe not very much. Other times we are basically collecting data from people in the industry and constructing data sets which no one else would ever have access to, and there can be quite a lot of work in terms of collecting things consistently across people within an industry, say, and combining things that have come from different sources. There are sort of different groups within the office to help support do that. So it just, again, varies massively depending on what's involved. So sometimes an economist will have the skills necessary. It would be most efficient for them to do it. Sometimes we have, so if I think back to our digital advertising market study, we used the expertise of our data team, so the specialists in the CMA, to collect and ingest very large data sets to analyze during the course of that case. And so it really depends on the specifics of the case and what we're looking to do, but there's a range of different options, from people basically having the expertise themselves to drawing on other parts of the CMA and people with more experience.
Can I add on that one of the advantages of drawing in our own data sets is that they're specific to the questions that we're trying to answer. So although there's more data processing involved in it, what the output should be is something that is going directly to our questions, rather than perhaps having to find a publicly available database or some data that's similar to what you're looking for and then interpret it. So that's, I think, the advantage of using things internally.
There's a question about team days, so I don't know if anyone wants to talk about. The quick answer is yes, but go on, Alex.
I was going to say, I mean, in the Manchester office, we all came to agreement on a Tuesday will be that what we call the anchor day. So that's when most people are in, and then around that people work, depending on how their preference. So yeah, that's my experience from the Manchester office.
And I guess there's also, as an economist group, we have in the last few years at least, we've had 2 annual gatherings where we've got all of the economists together twice a year in one location for a big sort of away day where we talk about things as a team as a whole. Layla, I don't know if you're going to add anything.
Just wanted to add that in the Edinburgh office, I said there are a few of us, and we actually have sort of come up with this arrangement naturally that a lot of us do like to come into the office, and we sit together in the same space within the wider office. So actually, on any given day, if you come in, you'll see quite a few economists in, and we just naturally do this because we like to hang out together.
And then there's another question about data and specific statistical software packages. I mean, we use everything from Excel, Stata, R. Some people use Python. Whether no, I don't think. Well, I don't think anyone on this call probably has expertise in all of those things. And you know, there would be a very small number of people who would ever use Python. A slightly larger number of people who would use R, more people who would use Stata at some point, and then pretty much every economist would use Excel. But again, it's one of those things where there's lots of different people within the office who have different levels of expertise in different packages, but there's no sort of universal requirements for people to be familiar with any particular software packages.
I suppose the other thing is if you are interested in it, but you don't currently kind of know how to use a particular package, there's lots of, again, sort of training and support for people to kind of get up to speed with those, and then kind of look for cases where you can implement those skills, even though it's not a requirement to kind of come in being familiar with all these packages.
I don't know if Alex or Layla, you want to talk about hybrid working as people who are based in a smaller office outside of London.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. So I think it works really well. So I've always been based in Edinburgh, and I've been on well, mostly merger cases, and I felt that it was much of a disadvantage. I think the CMA facilitates travel between offices. So whenever there is a big meeting that I feel like it would be better to attend in person, there are no issues with me traveling. And it goes both ways. Sometimes people from London find it beneficial to come up and collaborate with people who are based in Edinburgh, for example. So in that sense, I think that can sometimes be helpful to build links with people, meet them in real life. But generally, because post-pandemic, we've got flexible working arrangements and a lot of people working from home. So actually being based in a regional office is not really that much of a disadvantage. And quite often you would join a meeting from Edinburgh, and a number of people who are based in London are joining remotely as well. So I think that works really well. It's not really been an impediment to, becoming influential or just kind of integrating yourself into a team. So I think it works really well, and the tech generally works quite well, facilitates hybrid working.
Yeah, I mean, second to what Layla said, yeah, I've had the same experience. So yeah, nothing further to add.
Yeah, I think as a group, as a whole, for the economists, we try and be quite clear that, if you're working with someone who's based in another office, say on a project that's lasting a reasonable period of time, there's an expectation that you should try and meet in person and travel. One person should travel to work with the other person and sort of build that in-person relationship if you can, and we're very supportive of people doing that. There's a question about whether the positions are only open for UK citizens. So I'll quickly pick that up. The quick answer is no, you don't have to be a UK national. You do have to have the appropriate rights to work in the UK. And then there are some civil service nationality rules. There should be information about that in the job advert. So if you go to civil service jobs and find the role profiles or the job adverts, there should be information about exactly what position you need to be in order to apply for a job at the CMA. Unfortunately, we are bound by various civil service rules, which affects what we can offer. Okay, maybe if there's 2 final questions, maybe if we just pick up those and then finish, because I'm conscious it's 6 o'clock. So there's one about running competition analysis in general prior to the start of a case, or do we start fresh when we have a case in hand? So sometimes it depends a bit what type of case. So suppose we are doing a piece of discretionary work, which is a lot of our markets work. So this is stuff that we have control over whether to launch. Then we will naturally internally do a sort of preparatory phase where we look at public information. We might talk to a few key stakeholders if we can, and we'll sort of scope out the case. So we might do a bit of analysis beforehand, whereas if it's stuff that tends to be non-discretionary, so mergers that we have to look at and so on, we won't do work beforehand because we won't know the case is coming. But the first thing that will happen is the party send us a draft merger notice, say, and then we will begin the process of thinking about that industry in that case. Not all of that work is done subject to a deadline. So basically, there's a period called pre-notification in merger cases, where we make sure we have the information we need from the merging parties before we start a case. But essentially, we are starting sort of fresh. And then there's a question about forecasting tools to model what the market would be post-merger. I mean, I don't think I would describe what we do as sort of forecasting. It's more along the lines of judgment calls, but ultimately we're trying to think about, merger controllers' perspective. We're trying to think about what the impact would be in the future of a merger. So we are trying to use the information we have available right now to think about what the future impact of the case, but we tend not to, either because it's just not practical, because the data available, go out and sort of make precise forecasts about what's going to happen in the future in an industry. And then one final question about whether the assistant director roles focus on managing research. I guess it depends a little bit what you mean by research. So I guess one answer is that the sort of research element of the CMA and the economics group within the CMA is now to some extent part of the microeconomics unit's expertise. So they were established to provide advice to government on policies and also to advance the CMA's research functions. So which can be things like they've done a report recently on labour markets and concentration in labour markets in the UK. So if that's what you have in mind by research, then I think that's sort of more in the microeconomics units area. But then I think a lot of what we do, especially when we're thinking about planning cases and so on, I would think of as doing research in terms of understanding how an industry works and what sort of economic framework you should have in mind and how you should go about planning for a case. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts to add. No. If not, thank you very much everyone for joining us. As I say, if you're interested in applying, please do go to civil service jobs. You can sign up for notifications and so on. So as I say, at the moment, we've got assistant director positions open in economics, but we'll shortly be having our grade 7, so that's the economic advisor positions opening soon. So if you're interested in that role and think it might be more suitable for you, you can sign up for notifications and you should get notified when that round goes live. But thank you very much and have a good evening, everyone.